Welcome, fellow creatures of the night, to this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club. Here we venture deep into the nocturnal lands of the strange, the morbid, the absurd, and the obscure in film, books, TV, fairy tales, urban legends, and many other forms of pop culture. We discuss and analyse these texts to explore the fascinating ways they reflect, comment on, and critique the world we live in from its darker side. I'm Xenia, that one overmotivated nerd who won't let anyone else get a word in, and I declare this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club officially in session. I am delighted that you have returned for this second part of our little double feature about the history of cursed velvet necklaces and the doomed women who wear them. If you haven't heard the first part yet, that is episode 10, Heads Will Roll, a promising title if I say so myself. Go listen to that first. It will all make a lot more sense. And you will get some really cool fashion inspiration as a bonus. And, who doesn't want that? Also, regarding that first part, I do have to make a correction because I lied. The French guillotined woman with a necklace that we extensively spoke about in part 1, she doesn't have her final curtain call so far in Dumas' La Femme au collier de velours, but in a story by Gaston Leroux, the author of The Phantom of the Opera, that story has the same title as Dumas' story, La Femme au collier de velours, and it is from the 1920s, so quite a bit after the Dumas story in the mid-1800s. This chokered lady's story takes place at a masked ball where a woman is sort of pretend executed for show, but soon the rumour spreads that her velvet choker may be not only an ornament but serve a different purpose that at this point we're all very familiar with. This story kind of went under my radar somehow, but it does sound fascinating, and I'd be happy to do a little add-on talking about it once I've read it. Let me know if you'd like that, or if you've had enough of the decapitation for now. Maybe finish listening to this episode and then decide if you've had enough of the decapitation, because there will be quite a bit of decapitation. I didn't try to pack it into this episode as well, because thematically it would have very much belonged to the first part, and I kind of wanted to keep the two main eras and main directions that the story of the woman with the ribbon takes separate. So in this episode, in part 2, we leave the guillotined girls and the French Revolution behind and trace the velvet necklace further through time into a period of the 20th century that too was defined by revolution. This revolution did not decapitate kings, but it did aim to dethrone a tyrant who wore no crown, but a suit the woman at the dry cleaners had freed of all its stains for the low price of her minimum wage and tactfully ignoring a sleazy joke. A tyrant who didn't sit in a castle, but in Parliament, in the Senate, in corporate boardrooms and legal offices, at writing desks, in labs, hospitals, universities, and at millions of tables and millions of dining rooms, waiting for his dinner, served hot at 7 o'clock sharp. And he would have been quite happy if only the children weren't always bothering him with their silly questions and their stories about school, and if he didn't already know he'd have to spend half an hour later that night convincing Linda that really her migraine couldn't be that bad again. And why on earth was she always wearing that stupid necklace? But before we begin, here is a content warning. This episode discusses misogyny, gender-based and intimate partner violence, including violent death. There are a few quotes from the two stories, The Bloody Chamber and The Husband Stitch, that we'll analyse that are quite graphic in their descriptions of emotional, physical or sexual violence. If these descriptions in particular are something you'd rather not hear, you can skip the direct quotes. I will let you know when they come up. The Bloody Chamber and the discussion around it also deals with an adult-minor relationship, and it contains graphic descriptions of deconstructed and staged dead bodies. And if you're like me and the most disturbing thing in the world for you is people keeping dead bodies in the place where they live, be aware that is also part of this story. And of course, as always, when we discuss topics of, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, you can find a link in the description that takes you to international resources, helplines, and information for people affected by domestic violence and sexual violence. There is help out there if you or someone you know need it. And finally, a disclaimer. I will be talking about gender as a binary quite a bit in this episode, so about men and women as groups in the social and political world, and about some connections between biological characteristics and gender inequality. That does not mean that I believe gender is a binary or determined by anatomy, or that I want to dismiss non-binary people or the trans community overall. I also don't mean to say that individual women and men all fit into a generalized stereotyping box. What I do mean when I use terms like women or men for sort of groups, these are like generalized ideas, trends, and the larger structures that affect people depending on which gender they present as, identify as, and also are identified as by others. I hope this makes sense and you know what I mean. Okay, let's go. After several decades of absence, the woman with the velvet necklace rose from the tomb of time and found her way into writing again. In the 1970s, several scary stories of ribboned ladies burst onto the scene in a genre that, if we consider the sexualized elements of the early versions we discussed last time, is a little unexpected. They were children's stories. The first of these that I could find was a very short tale, only one page, in a book of creepy games, riddles, and stories called Ghostly Fun by Anne McGovern. A few years later, a longer, more detailed, and much scarier version by one Miss J.B. Stamper was published in a collection called Stories for the Midnight Hour. In 1984, the year, not the book, Alvin Schwartz, the author of the beloved Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, published his own version of The Lady with the Necklace. And his is probably the most famous one in the US. It is a little bit different to the others, and the first one I found where the velvet ribbon is not black but green. What all of these tales have in common is that they are short, urban legend style scary stories for children or teenagers, depending on the version. And here's how they go. A man marries a beautiful young woman who always wears a velvet ribbon around her neck. The man is curious about the ribbon, somehow irritated, and he keeps asking the woman to take it off. But she refuses, saying that he will be sorry if she ever removes the necklace. And this exchange of him asking about the necklace and her saying that he will be sorry if she takes it off is repeated over and over again. Now, at this point, the story can go two ways. There's the nice version by Schwartz, that we'll only touch on a little bit because we like things to be depressing. This nice version goes as follows. The husband respects his wife's boundaries. She's called Jenny, by the way. They happily grow old together until one day Jenny decides herself it is time to take off the ribbon. Her head falls off, she dies at a moment she herself chose when she'd had a good long life and was done with everyone's shit. I presume it's because the story is from 1984. Reagan had become president and she was like, yeah, I'm out. The not so nice version, that is also much more reflective of the guillotine stories, are the ones that Stamper and McGovern include in their versions. Here, the husband keeps nagging and nagging, but to no avail. The wife continues to tell him she won't take off her necklace or he'll be sorry. And sorry he will be when eventually driven almost mad by his strange obsession that he develops with his wife's necklace, when in the dead of night, his wife is soundly asleep, he creeps up like a massive creep with a pair of scissors and snips the velvet ribbon right through, killing his wife instantly as her head rolls to the floor. Personally, I really like the J.B. Stamper version, so the kind of longer one. And actually, I read the whole little collection of scary stories that she includes this story in. The Tales for the Midnight Hour. And they're actually pretty decent, creepy ghost stories that would have scared the shit out of me as a child. So 10 out of 10 would recommend. There's even like mummies who punish people for disrespecting their stuff. Excellent. We love it. Although, that story is set in the British Museum, so basically I feel like the mummy would have had to burn the whole place down, and I'll just punish this one guy who like stuck a chewing gum on like her son's coffin or whatever. We're not talking about that. But people get killed for disrespecting archaeological artifacts, which I think is very correct. Now, at first glance, what these children's stories versions of the woman with the necklace are really is just creepy stories to give kids a fright. But as with every tale, especially one that suddenly re-emerges from the depths of history like this one, there is more to it. To me, what was most noticeable about these short children's tales compared with the stories in part 1 is that the notion of the man becoming obsessed with removing the woman's necklace really moves to the center. In all the texts that we looked at last time, the men developed some sort of obsession, but there was only one of them who specifically was fixated on removing the necklace, and that was the Horace Smith version with the frat boy guy Eveling, who kept trying to remove the woman's collar and she would shriek and disappear into thin air. But none of the more famous stories like Washington Irving's or Dumas' versions even mention this detail. It's simply not a thing. So the question arises why something that was basically a marginal detail in the past became the core of the narrative in the 20th century. To answer this question, we need to take a look at the socio-political landscape that these stories emerged from. In particular, at a movement or collection of movements that really created a shift in the Western Hemisphere in the 1960s and 70s and far beyond. We need to take a look at what we call the second wave of feminism. The information in this section is from a book by Margaret Krasch called Feminismus, Geschichte, Positionen. That is like an overview over the many different feminist movements, their different points of focus, their theories, key figures, developments over time, and so on. What I really like about this book is that it highlights how much feminist movements have always intersected with movements for racial and class equality and queer rights and so on. So it really has this focus on intersectionality as well, which I think is really, really good. Yeah, let's get into it. The second wave of feminism rolled in at the end of the 1960s. It had developed following the massive student protests against the Vietnam War in the US. These quickly spread throughout the country and spilled over into Europe in the form of protests and general strikes, especially in France and Germany. These were not really feminist movements yet. On the contrary, many of the men in these left-wing movements were super misogynistic on a personal level, or they simply didn't care about including women's rights in their activism. Their focus was anti-conservative and anti-materialist, so socioeconomic class was very important. A notion of general equal rights for the entire population is of course closely related to, class equality, even if not everyone in these movements realized that. Now, in the US, these late 60s movements were intertwined with the civil rights movement that fought for racial equality around the same time, and a huge portion of the feminist movement that developed from here was, because of this, also intertwined with the civil rights movement. This was sort of also known as Black feminism. At the same time, there were white feminist movements in the US that didn't really take race into account, the origins of the infamous white feminism, and they focused more on things like divorce laws, work conditions, and sexual freedom. So, from its beginnings, we see a second wave of feminism that's very much defined by its broadness and sort of internal difference, and a lot of intersectionality with other important movements, but also a certain distance between different types of feminist movements. As an example for this diversity and intersectionality and conflict within different feminist movements, I briefly want to mention Angela Davis, who you've likely heard of, at least since the big Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, because her work was brought up a lot during that time. And if you don't recognize her name, you probably recognize her immortal quote: "In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist." So Angela Davis is a philosopher and writer and has been a professor at several different universities. She was one of the key figures in the anti-capitalist, anti-war movement of the 1960s, a member of the US Communist Party, and she also continues to be an incredibly important civil rights activist. Her writings in the 1970s were, and still are, crucial to the Black feminist movement. They dealt a lot with the intersectionality of racism and misogyny that Black women in the US face, as opposed to the different type of misogyny that white women deal with, that, is focused on their gender but doesn't include racial discrimination. And ever since she became so important in the late 60s, early 70s, Angela Davis has continued to write about issues of class, of ethnicity, of gender and race, capitalism, and the lack of democracy in a capitalist system, in a way that interlinks all these issues and shows how they all depend on one another. And this connectedness, but also the conflicts and contradictions within movements, like the contrast between Black feminism and white feminism that I've mentioned, all these topics that Davis discusses in her work represents the character of second wave feminism very well. Another example of a conflict within feminism was that many women who fought for their rights were very stereotyping in which characteristics they saw as feminine or masculine, and based this on allegedly inherent biology. There was the idea that violence, for example, was only a masculine thing and women couldn't be violent. But other feminists in the same period, like for example Doris Lessing, a British author, criticised this very harshly and said that you couldn't paint all women with the same brush and all men with another. It wasn't all about biology. There was a big impact that, the way children were raised and educated made, and also people's decisions. And that is, by the way, also what Simone de Beauvoir wrote about 20 years earlier in her really, really important book, The Second Sex, where she described the roles that we assign to people based on female or male biology as complete constructs that, reaffirm themselves because they're already so strongly established, but that could be changed. This idea was then expanded on in the 90s by Judith Butler, who describes gender as something you do rather than something you are. But we aren't quite there yet in the second wave of feminism. That's a couple more years down the road. Naturally, because of the diversity inside the movement, the second wave of feminism added many different issues to the big board of things that need fixed. There were a few key topics, though, that many of these diverse feminisms, from their own perspectives, brought very prominently into the public sphere of discussion. And two of these sets of issues are crucial to our ribboned ladies' stories today. They are rigid gender roles in marriages that assign husbands power over their wives, and the question of women's bodily autonomy, especially focusing on violence against women and sexual freedom, or rather the lack thereof. Now, for this episode, we will mostly look at dynamics and patriarchal structures in the way that they affect heterosexual marriages. So this is less about, things like workplace or strangers or other, dynamics, where of course all of these structures also play a role, but for this episode, we're mostly looking at power imbalance and disrespecting bodily autonomy within intimate relationships and specifically within marriage. Many of the second wave feminist movements criticized the institution of marriage as oppressive because it forced women into the private space, into raising children and taking care of their husbands as their main job, keeping them out of the public sphere and the political sphere. Divorce laws as well were often unfairly formulated, and because of this, it was much easier for men to divorce their wives than for women to divorce their husbands. Plus, there was a lot of stigma attached to women leaving their husbands, or even if they were, left by their husbands, it was kind of seen as the woman having failed somehow. And I think that is something that is still present in many people's heads today, based on like my personal experience, which is a shame. During the 60s and 70s, there was a strong element of financial control involved in marriage as well. Again, that is something that is still the case in many marriages, but back then this was also kind of rooted in the law. In many, many countries, women weren't allowed to open a bank account without their husband's permission. If you're my age, your grandmother very likely couldn't have a bank account if her husband didn't sign for it. My grandmother couldn't have a bank account here in Switzerland if her husband didn't sign for it, which is completely insane. I think this was in the 60s. Crazy. Like how? How are you not allowed to have money? Messed up. And then we have the even more messed up issue of violence. Especially sexual violence was something that was very centrally discussed in second wave feminism. Probably because it was a combination of a breach of bodily autonomy in general and of self-determined sexuality as well. So this was a key issue that most feminist movements tried to bring to light. This went from critiquing the objectification of women in pornography, over pointing out machismo, men being offended or aggressive at sexual rejection, protests against the dangers of being sexually assaulted when going out after dark. Maybe you've heard of these Take Back the Night protests. That's what they were about how unsafe it was for women to be out after dark and how they wanted to reclaim this time and this space. But also second wave feminists were some of the first to bring attention to the patriarchal idea that sex is a marital duty, that wives owe their husbands sex, and how this can then very easily be used as a justification for marital rape or other kinds of intimate partner violence. Marital rape also has only been illegal in most Western countries for like 20-30 years, which is insane. Again, what is this world? Now, even though the legislation has thankfully changed, these are points that are still very important and only slowly being recognized today, right? Just look at the sheer amount of victim blaming we still see when women, and men as well, come forward about sexual violence, especially when they had some sort of relationship with a perpetrator. There's always this, from some people, this instant jump to justifying the sexual violence, being like, oh, this was transactional, or they knew what was going to happen, or they actually wanted blah blah. Horrible. Where was I? This is making me too angry, okay? As a side note, to illustrate how closely some of these second wave feminisms connected sexuality and women's rights, or rather heteronormative sexuality and a lack of women's rights, there were some radical feminists who claimed that any form of penetrative sex was an act of violence against the woman because it was directly linked to reproduction, and reproduction was the criteria on which patriarchal oppression was based. So basically their thought was that sex that has the aim of reproduction is automatically, partaking in the oppression of women. There was also the idea that women who had sex with men were betraying the feminist cause by literally sleeping with the enemy, So the argument was that for change to happen, women had to opt out of marriage and heterosexual relationships. And interestingly, this notion has resurfaced recently. I'm sure you've seen it around on like social media, where American women post about not sleeping with their boyfriends because they'd voted for Donald Trump in the last election. I know it was inspired by or coincides with, I'm not sure. But at the same time, there's also the 4B movement in Korea, where women swear off romantic and sexual relationships with men for political reasons. So, this idea of directly connecting sort of heterosexual relationships and oppression and opting out of these relationships in order to do something against oppression is, yeah, it's coming back, which is very interesting. At this point in the episode, we're still far off the present though. First, we have to take a good look at our girls with velvet ribbon stories from the 70s. So, excluding the Schwartz one with Jenny, we can easily read the ribbon and the removal of the ribbon by the husband as reflections of these exact criticisms of marriage and a sexualized, violent disregard of women's bodily autonomy within heterosexual relationships. At the core of these stories, we get the conflict of the wife who keeps telling her husband to leave her ribbon alone, and the husband becoming increasingly irritated by that. She sets a clear boundary about her own body, about something on her body that she doesn't want him to touch, to mess with. As a result of her setting this boundary, the husband becomes fixated on this precise detail, on the one thing that his wife clearly tells him he doesn't get to get involved with, that he doesn't get to control. And because he doesn't get to control it, he really, really wants to control it. So much that he completely disregards her warnings, cuts off her ribbon, and inadvertently kills her. We can establish at this point that this husband killed his wife not on purpose, but he kills her through an act of disrespect nonetheless. He can't know that her head will fall off, and I don't think anyone would expect that. But the violation of her boundaries, of her bodily autonomy, that is very deliberate. He knows that his wife doesn't want him to touch, let alone remove her necklace. By doing it anyway, he clearly crosses her boundaries, both in an emotional sense, because he goes against what she told him she really doesn't want him to do, and in a very physical sense too. And the result of this violation, this disrespect, is her death and a very extreme breach of her body, a whole body part falling off. In light of the second wave feminism movement, we can read this as a reflection of the systemic problem that women's bodily autonomy isn't really taken seriously. That, women not giving consent to something being done to their body is so often simply ignored. I think we can easily interpret this core of the story as an analogy to or a metaphor for sexual violence and also physical violence within romantic relationships. It's important that the person who removes the necklace is the husband in the story and not a stranger. It's also important to note that he removes the necklace while the wife is asleep. Through this, the story makes it very clear that a lot of the time, the people who do violate, in this case, women's bodily autonomy, are people close to them, people they trust. Very often, it will be their husband. And this, of course, leads us into the role of traditional heterosexual marriage and power structures within marriage that second wave feminism was very critical of. Their point was that in a society where one gender has so much more power than the other in public and political life, they, of course, also have a lot more power in private life. Simply put, if you have almost no way to leave your husband if he treats you badly because it's difficult to get a divorce, it's difficult to get a decent job, there's little support, you're likely to be shunned and stigmatized as a divorced woman, then your husband can do whatever the hell he wants to you without really having to fear any consequences. That is the power imbalance that second wave feminism drew so much attention to. It's this power imbalance that makes intimate partner violence so common, according to their argument. Of course, intimate partner violence doesn't only exist in like male-female relationships. So obviously that is not the only factor that comes into play, but that was their argument. So yeah, according to them, the patriarchal power imbalance and the lack of respect for women's bodily autonomy go hand in hand. And I think this refusal of bodily autonomy comes out especially well in the Stamper story. Here, the husband is characterized as a dominant, strange, obsessive guy, referred to as a strange old man at the beginning. And I haven't told you this yet, but he won't even give up control over the wife's body after she's died. He keeps it for many years in a locked room, continuing to exert control over her by keeping her contained in the domestic space, the space that women in marriage were traditionally confined to, in a room that only he has access to, that since she is dead, she can never escape from. It's also weird that nobody notices that she's just gone, right? That could also be a hint towards how society as a whole doesn't really question or doesn't really worry about what happens to women if, the husband has some sort of like half decent explanation. I don't know. So far, so straightforward. Now, where it gets even more interesting is when we look at the characterization of the wives more closely. The first thing that I noticed was that these women are unnamed and they're not fleshed out characters. We have no insight into them, we don't know what they think or feel. They have no backstory and only ever appear as the wife. We know a little bit more about the husbands, but not a lot. They're also unnamed. At first glance, this might look as if we're not supposed to empathize with the characters or see them as people, but I think we can also read it in a different way that personally I prefer because it's more interesting. And that is that these characters are so blank and anonymous because they are universal. They're not meant to be specific individuals, but they could be anyone. They reflect an overarching issue. Is it overarching or overarching? Overarching, right? I don't know why I can't say that word. Overarching issue, a bigger dynamic, the bigger picture, and not an individual situation. They're not an exception. The second thing that I find interesting about the female characters also goes into how little we know about them. You may remember in the guillotine stories, the woman with necklace always has an origin story, and that's where the horror comes from, right? The horror comes from the fact that we find out her origin story of she was guillotined and has actually been dead all along. She's kind of walking the line between life and death and a body that can be reassembled and taken apart. But here, we have no idea. We don't know if the women are dead and resurrected like in those old stories, or if they are alive but their lives are precariously hanging by just one narrow velvet band. So these women, before they lose their heads, are both alive and dead, and also neither. They're pretty much Schrodinger's cat. Unless you take off the ribbon, you have no idea. So effectively, for the reader, they're both dead and alive at the same time. And this metaphor of living death is also something that came up in second wave feminism in connection with marriage. The American writer Betty Friedan explicitly described the state women exist in when they are married in a patriarchal world with strict gender roles. She described this state as living death, where the woman is alive but has no life of her own. She has no control over her decisions beyond what to cook for dinner. She has no power over her own body when it comes to reproductive rights or gender expression or sexual freedom. She is forced to live in lanes so narrow that she is practically dead. And to have here a story from that same second wave feminist period where these wife characters are in a state of living death is an interesting parallel. I briefly want to mention The Girl with a Green Ribbon, which is the Alvin Schwartz story, the only one by a male author today, by the way, and it's also a little bit later than the Stamper and the McGovern versions. It's from the mid-80s. And interestingly, this one doesn't include the issue of bodily autonomy being disrespected, right? Here we have Jenny, who also has a name, and she has the agency over her body and her life. Her husband asks her about the ribbon, but then he leaves it alone when she says, that's none of your business. And I was wondering whether this is an overlooking of these issues or an empowering twist. It's difficult to tell. It really could be either. Maybe it's a little bit of both. I don't know. Missing out on the criticism by trying to make it more empowering. I think that's something we also see a lot in texts that try to be feminist, so I could imagine that also being here. But what's also fascinating is that it's not just Jenny who is different to the other women with necklaces, but also the husband, right? The husband is respectful and he just chills out. And I could imagine that this is reflective of a new model of more emotional, affectionate masculinity that became popular for a while in the 1980s, when this story is from. And this was actually a result of second wave feminism that kind of brought about the rise of the so-called new man, who was kind of celebrated in the lifestyle world, partially also because, you could sell stuff to them, because this new man was supposed to be a man who cried and looked after his kids and wore cute outfits. Kind of a positive example of a more emotional, slightly more feminine masculinity, in the most stereotypical sense, and that emotion is feminine. Yeah. But I could imagine it being the influence of this new kind of male gender role as well that we see in this story here. I would say that these children's stories reflect these second wave feminism concerns around power dynamics in straight marriages and bodily autonomy, but they do it in a masked way. They code them through this central sign of the velvet necklace that, comes to stand in for the intactness of the wife's body when it is treated with respect, but also the thing that indicates how extremely destructive the consequences are when that respect is breached. This sort of coded way of approaching the topic of bodily autonomy makes a lot of sense in a children's story, right? The act of violation has to be masked in some way, coded into an action like removing a necklace, partially because you don't want to full-on traumatize the children, but you also want them to understand that a violation has happened, right? So I think it makes a lot of sense that the old motif of the woman whose head falls off when her necklace is removed resurfaces with a new focus for new times. Or more precisely, it takes a small kernel that was already there, that of a man violating a woman's body in a sexual/romantic context, in the Guy Eveling story, and makes that the story. And I think it's very effective in making the violation, that is, of course, in the realm of fantastical, right? The stories make it feel very harsh and sudden and shocking. And I think that's why the image is so strong and it works so well. Even though as a child you may not understand what it is that is being coded into the story. You may not really understand what kind of violation is hinted at here. I'm sure you'll get the message of what the husband did was wrong. It had very bad consequences. He should have listened to his wife's warning. I'm sure that children are able to get this message from these stories. Now, in our next story, that is definitely not for children, the power imbalances and violations that can exist within traditional marriage become very explicit. This story is from 1979, so the same era, and the woman with the necklace makes her appearance in a different way. One that is a little bit more reminiscent of last episode, of the last part. And this story is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. Angela Carter was a British author and journalist who is often associated with second wave feminism. In her fiction works, she mostly wrote surrealism and magical realism, so stories that distort reality or include elements of the fantastic. Often this was a sort of haunting gothic fantasy. You know I'm gonna like that. One important part of her fiction work is a brilliant collection of short fairy tale retellings that The Bloody Chamber is part of. These stories are amazing. They are extremely clever and beautifully written. They're also quite disturbing at times, but really, really good. I highly recommend reading them, but check content warnings. Fittingly, this story here is the most violent and graphic we've got today, and as I said at the start, I'll give you a warning before graphic passages so you can skip them if you need to. As we go through this story, The Bloody Chamber, you may wonder what it is doing here, because even though we have the obligatory newly wedded couple we've met in the children's stories, you'll see that this one is missing a very crucial element of the woman with the velvet necklace stories, the ending where her head, upon removal of the mysterious necklace, falls off. In fact, the young woman in this story doesn't emerge from the unknown with a necklace already in place at all. In fact, she doesn't wear a velvet necklace. And yet, when I researched the last episode and its guillotine fashion, I instantly had to think of her. Because this girl, we'll call her the heroine, this girl has a collar of blood red rubies gifted by her husband as a wedding present. It doesn't disguise a fatal wound or keep her head tied to her neck, but it has a lot to do with beheading. Amongst other things, it tells you exactly where to cut. The story begins with our heroine, an unnamed girl of 17, riding a train bound for her freshly betrothed husband's castle on the Normandy coast. The young girl, she speaks to us in the first person, talks about how she met her husband, who we only know as the Marquis. He is a much older nobleman, the richest man in France, who has had 3 previous wives. The last of these wives died only 3 months before the heroine met him, in a boating accident, allegedly, and her body could never be found, allegedly. It's giving Rebecca, it's giving suspicious. Wouldn't recommend going to that man's house. The heroine does go to the man's house, unfortunately. She is impressed by the Marquis's cool, collected manner, his face that always remains unmoved, which, we can't really blame her for. She's a teenager. Now, she mostly marries him to financially support her family, who don't have a lot of money, but she's also very curious about being married, about seeing his castle and his riches, and especially she's curious about what it will be like to have sex. The heroine describes her silk nightgown that her husband gave her, how it feels on her thighs, how excited she gets at the way he looks at her, how she adores his scent of leather and spices, the scent of every single masculine love interest ever. And she feels jealous when she is reminded of the Marquis's previous wives, a Romanian countess, a former barmaid turned art model, and the first, an opera singer, who the girl saw perform a long time ago when she was just a child. The heroine, as she says now, joins his gallery of beautiful women as a modest contrast to these graces. Although the heroine has some good stuff going for her, she is a distinguished piano player. Her mother spent all her money to send her to the conservatory so the girl could develop a great skill and make her own money eventually. And speaking of the mother, she has not only cured people from illnesses, but also shot a, quote, man-eating tiger in Indochina, saving a whole village when she was only a teenager. Very impressive. And the Marquis? He's not that impressive. We learn that he smokes massive cigars, showers his young bride in expensive dresses, and that he gave her a special piece of jewelry as his wedding gift. Quote, his wedding gift clasped round my throat, a choker of rubies 2 inches wide, like an extraordinarily precious slit throat. After the terror, in the early days of the Directory, the aristos who'd escaped the guillotine had an ironic fad of tying a red ribbon round their necks at just the point where the blade would have sliced it through. A red ribbon like a memory of a wound. And his grandmother, the Marquis's grandmother, taken with the notion, had her ribbon made up in rubies. Such a gesture of luxurious defiance. We love a little lavish counter-revolutionary fashion reference, don't we? Maybe the Marquis's grandmother is the OG guillotine necklace lady. I love that we have a story that explicitly links its necklace to the red chokers of the jeunesse dorée that we talked about in part 1. What this ruby choker also does is identify the Marquis, descended from a woman who escaped the terror, marks him very clearly as someone who's descended from the old regime, from old money and generations of power, while the young woman, on the other hand, barely has anything at all. After all this introductory information, the girl and the Marquis arrive at his castle. This is not super relevant, but I love the way Angela Carter describes the castle, so you will have to listen to it. The fairy solitude of the place, with its turrets of misty blue, its courtyard, its spiked gate, its castle that lay on the very bosom of the sea with seabirds mewing about its attics, the casements opening onto the green and purple, evanescent departures of the ocean, cut off by the tide from land for half a day. That castle, at home neither on the land nor on the water, a mysterious, amphibious place, contravening the materiality of both earth and the waters, with the melancholy of a mermaiden who perches on her rock and waits, endlessly waiting for her lover who had drowned far away long ago. That lovely, sad sea siren of a place. What comes next is less gorgeous. This next bit deals with a pretty unsettling and questionably consensual sex scene in some detail, so you can skip forward about 2 minutes to avoid this. Arrived at the castle, the Marquis takes off his bride's clothes as if he were stripping the leaves off an artichoke, so he treats her like something to be handled and consumed and devoured. The heroine is terrified and kind of excited by this scene at the same time. Having left her naked, the Marquis has to go to work in his study. The heroine looks at some books, finds porn that is titled Reproof of Curiosity, where a disgusting old man, takes off the clothes of a child, like her husband just did. Upon this, the Marquis comes back and talks to her in a weird baby voice and tells her that she's too young to look at grown-up toys before taking her to the bedroom. He makes the girl wear the red choker and exposes her neck, all very costume de victime style, while the marriage is consummated. By having her made up that way during the sexual act as a person led to her execution, like the lamb to the slaughter, this consummation of the marriage has a very violent and brutal undertone, even though the scene isn't very explicit in what happens. The most explicit line we get is that the Marquis impales her, which of course is a violent metaphor for penetrative sex, but that's as, graphic as it gets. In addition, however, there is a lot of death imagery going on at the same time. There are white lilies associated with funerals all around the room, and they make the room look like an embalming parlor, the heroine says, and their scent reminds her of treated flesh. And for the rest of the day, the Marquis insists on the heroine wearing a transparent white muslin dress and her ruby choker, again replicating the outfit of, those awaiting execution. Which, that kind of tells us what might happen. After that whole situation, the Marquis has to leave on a business trip. And before he goes, he hands the heroine his keys. keys upon keys for every room in the castle, for every cabinet and desk drawer, and all of them free for her to explore. Except one. There is one key that he tells her she must never ever use. Never open the door it belongs to. This door leads to a small room at the bottom of the West Tower that he calls his enfer, his own personal hell. And here you may realize that you've heard this story before. I told you earlier that the Bloody Chamber comes from a collection of fairy tale rewritings, and the fairy tale that this specific story is based on is none other than the French fairy tale of Bluebeard. Yes, it's the French again. It's always the French, okay? We're not escaping the French as long as we talk about the necklace ladies, okay? Because this fairy tale is what this story is based on, let's take a bit of a closer look at it. The Bluebeard fairy tale was written down in its best known version by Charles Perrault in the 17th century, and apparently it was a popular folk tale at the time and had been around for a while. There are also English language versions in the story of the robber bridegroom, for example, but Bluebeard with that name is the French iteration of it all. According to Perrault's story, Bluebeard is a very wealthy but extremely ugly man, and his ugliest feature is his blue beard that a lot of people make fun of. Now, Bluebeard wants to get married, and he finds a girl from a noble but poor family. She's called Fatima. She doesn't want to marry him, firstly because he is ugly, and secondly because he had married several times before, but nobody really knows where all those wives had gone. But, you know, according to Fatima, the ugliness is worse than that extremely suspicious disappearing of wives. Fortunately for Bluebeard, he manages to impress Fatima and her mother and her sister with his riches, and he can convince her to marry him. After that happens, Bluebeard takes Fatima and her sister to his castle, where he showers them in gifts and entertainment. But one day he needs to go attend business in a distant part of the country, and like the Marquis, or rather the Marquis, like Bluebeard, gifts his young wife a set of keys for all the rooms in the house. And one of the keys is special. Bluebeard says to Fatima, "This small key belongs to the blue closet at the end of the long gallery on the ground floor. I give you leave," he continued, "to open or do what you like with all the rest of the castle, except this closet. Now, my dear, remember you must not enter it, nor even put the key into the lock. If you do not obey me in this, expect the most dreadful of punishments." But of course, Fatima is won over by her curiosity, and uses the small key to open the blue closet. Fatima opens the door just like the heroine of the Bloody Chamber. And it is this bloody chamber that both girls find behind the forbidden door. Angela Carter's heroine has the whole castle illuminated with every candle, every bulb to be had, and roams through the rooms searching for a sign of her husband's soul, his true self. At last, she reaches the final room at the bottom of the West Tower, the forbidden room, buried deep within the bowels of the castle. She unlocks the door, and she finds a torture chamber. Quote, "Until that moment, this spoiled child did not know she had inherited nerves and a will from the mother who had defied the outlaws of Indochina. My mother's spirit drove me on into that dreadful place in a cold ecstasy to know the very worst. I fumbled for the matches in my pocket. What a dim, lugubrious light they gave. And yet enough, oh more than enough, to see a room designed for desecration and some dark night of unimaginable lovers whose embraces were annihilation. And the lovers who have been annihilated are still there. The 3 previous wives of the Marquis, his wives and his victims. Here we'll talk about the contents of the chamber a bit more. This includes dead bodies and injuries, so if you'd rather not hear that, you can skip forward 3 minutes. The Marquis's first wife, the opera singer, lies in a catafalque surrounded by red candles, quite naked, under a thin sheet of very rare and precious linen, such as the princes of Italy used to shroud those whom they had poisoned. I touched her very gently on the white breast. She was cool. He had embalmed her. On her throat I could see the blue imprint of his strangler's fingers. The cool, sad flame of the candles flickered on her white, closed eyelids. The worst thing was, the dead lips smiled. Of the second wife, the model, only the skull is left, hung up high in the air, crowned with a wreath of white roses and the veil of a bride. But of the third wife, the Romanian countess, there is no trace, until the heroine hears the iron maiden that stands in the corner creak. With trembling fingers I prized open the front of the upright coffin, with its sculpted face caught in a rictus of pain. Then, overcome, I dropped the key I still held in my other hand. It dropped into the forming pool of her blood. She was pierced, not by one but by 100 spikes, this child of the land of the vampires, who seemed so newly dead. Hauntingly, the chamber is decorated with the same lilies that the heroine's bedroom is crowded with. She realizes that a horrific death is what the Marquis has planned for her as well, so he can add her to his cabinet of dead trophies. So the girl picks up the key she'd dropped into the pool of blood, runs to her music room, and tries to think of a way to escape Bluebeard's castle. She has help from a boy, the blind piano tuner, but we'll mostly leave out that part because it's not that important for us. What matters is that the Marquis suddenly returns and asks for his keys back. But there is a problem. No matter how much the heroine tries to clean the blood from the key to the chamber, it won't come off. So the heroine tries to distract and possibly strangle the Marquis by seducing him. But this doesn't work. He finds the bloody key and, satisfied that she walked right into his trap, because a trap it was all along, he announces that he will behead his new wife in the morning. And for her death by decapitation, she is to wear her white muslin dress and the red ruby collar. As you do for an execution, right? The next morning, in the courtyard, the Marquis waits for the heroine with a sword in his hand. Freud likes this. He makes her kneel down, lay her head on a stone, and raises the sword ready to strike. But then, a great battering and pounding at the gate, the jangling of the bell, the frenzied neighing of a horse. The unholy silence of the place shattered in an instant. The blade did not descend. The necklace did not sever. My head did not roll. For an instant, the beast wavered in his stroke, a sufficient split second of astonished indecision to let me spring upright and dart to the assistance of my lover, the piano tuner, as he struggled sightlessly with the great bolts that kept her out. The her at the gate is the heroine's mother, and when the door opens, the Marquis stands no chance. On her 18th birthday, my mother had disposed of a man-eating tiger that had ravaged the villages in the hills north of Hanoi. Now, without a moment's hesitation, she raised my father's gun, took aim, and put a single, irreproachable bullet through my husband's head. And so in this story, it is the wife who lives, and the husband, the destructive, powerful, oppressive husband who dies. We definitely have a twist there. There are so many interesting things to say about this story, but for today, we'll stay strictly on the necklaced woman and the second wave feminism theme. One, because otherwise we'll still be here in 6 years, and two, because when the much announced day comes when I do adapt my MA thesis for this podcast, we'll come back to it and look at it through another lens, and I don't want there to be too much overlap. So let's begin with a fundamental question. Why does Angela Carter merge the Bluebeard folktale with the motif of the beheaded woman and her telltale necklace by implementing a clear reference to the costume des victimes and the French Revolution? This question gets even more interesting when we realize that Angela Carter isn't the only one among our writers who does this. So Stamper's version, one of the children's stories, that invokes the Bluebeard figure in the husband as well. The story begins with a detail I only mentioned in passing earlier on, but that becomes important now. There was one room in the house the old man always kept locked. Things had not changed in that room for years. A soft layer of dust had settled on the furniture and on the thing that lay on the floor beside the bed. This is the opening line of the story, and the thing that they're talking about, as we later find out, is the wife's body. Side note, by referring to her body as a thing, she literally becomes objectified, turned into an object. Is that not fun? This opening line makes reference to the Bluebeard tale, right? Because it is also about a man who owns a locked room that contains the remains of his wife, right? It's the same concept. Now, within the context of second wave feminism, I think it makes a lot of sense to revive the Bluebeard tale. And it was revived quite a lot in the wake of second wave feminism, especially throughout the 1980s. Several authors, aside from just Angela Carter, like for example Joyce Carol Oates, who I have beef with, which we will maybe get to at some point, or Kurt Vonnegut, they both wrote variations of the Bluebeard material. Like these new versions of The Girl with the Velvet Necklace, this story also picks up the topic of intimate partner violence, the destructive kind of power that a husband can wield over his wife in a patriarchal world. And because the power imbalance at the core of the Bluebeard tale is the same one that sits at the core of the Necklaced women's stories, both of these stories circle around a central analogy where marriage equals the wife's death at the hands of the husband, because through marriage he takes power over her, her body, and her life itself. In The Bloody Chamber, this unequal marriage as living death idea is reflected in the death imagery in the bedroom, and especially during the consummation scene. We get the association of the bedroom with an embalming parlour through the white lilies and their scent. These lilies we then see again in the Bloody Chamber, so the lilies connect these spaces through a central death symbol, and this highlights that both rooms are sites of death for the wives, death through marriage and a loss of power and self-ownership, and actual physical death. At the same time, they are sites of exerting power for the husband. So, considering the issue of patriarchal gender inequality, the two stories of the Necklaced Woman and Bluebeard's Bride are predestined to collaborate in this period. They point out the same power imbalance in marriages within a patriarchal world that considers married women first and foremost as their husband's property, and therefore leaves them at their husband's mercy. Also, as a little extra nugget, the Bluebeard tale follows the structure of the modern slasher movie, complete with a monstrous killer, a series of female victims who are horribly killed and mutilated in a strange place, a place that is not their home, and there is a final girl who puts an end to the killing spree. Very interesting, could be a cool topic to look into as well. In general, the Bluebeard tale and the many faces it has worn throughout the centuries, from this fairy tale's older inspirations, over a Charles Dickens version, over something like Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, to, again, the classic slasher, to references in 50 Shades of Grey or the TV series You. Very varied, very interesting. Tell me if that's something you'd like to hear more about. But next, let's take a closer look at the ruby collar and what it might signify. You may remember the Solomon article about the guillotined women stories that I quoted a very, very, very long time ago back in part 1. In this article, Solomon interprets the velvet necklace with the guillotine clasp that Arsène wears in La Femme au collier de velours as a mark of ownership that her boyfriend Danton has put on her. For that story in particular, I wasn't really convinced by that point, but here in the Bloody Chamber, the ruby collar is definitely used by the Marquis to label the heroine as his possession. He also does this by deciding what clothes she is supposed to wear in addition to the necklace. And for us readers, the ruby collar becomes a symbol beyond this individual couple, a symbol for male control over women. At the same time, it is an omen, a deliberate foreshadowing for the violent death the Marquis has planned for his bride. This possession element is underlined by the fact that this is the only one in our stories where the woman doesn't wear her necklace from the beginning. She isn't already dead, like in the 19th century versions, and reanimated by the necklace. She also doesn't just mysteriously have the ribbon and we can't know where it or she came from. The ruby collar clearly comes from the Marquis, and the heroine is not some supernatural creature. Basically, this is a man who puts a collar on his wife when they get married. It's a wedding present, and when he puts the collar on her, he probably already knows that it marks her body with its future fatal wound. So this is a very powerful, rich older man putting a burden of suffering violence on this young girl who has very few options to defend herself. She truly is held captive by her necklace. And so the ownership of the husband over the wife and her death at his hands are equated. They are merged firmly into one in the symbol of the ruby collar. And because of this, I would read the collar as a mark of the power, financial, social, and physical, that the Marquis holds over the heroine. I would also read the fact that they are merged into one object as a metaphor for how the power of ownership and the physical power exerted through intimate partner violence are interconnected. They are one and the same. Basically, because under patriarchal structures, the wife is considered the man's property, he can do with her what he likes. He can physically hurt her and get away with it. His power of ownership protects him from being held responsible for physical violence. The power imbalance between the heroine and the Marquis is even more extreme because Angela Carter brings class into play as well. None of the other stories from the 70s we've looked at really do that. But it does make sense when we remember the input about second wave feminism that a writer combines gender inequality and class inequality. After all, the second wave feminist movement developed from anti-capitalist socialist movements, so the class connection, is already kind of baked into it in a sense. This element of class inequality and really exploitation comes out clearly because the heroine reminds the reader several times that she marries the Marquis at least partly out of duty towards her family, who are poor and will benefit from her getting married to this wealthy man. A man who is nobility and apparently the richest man in France. A man who is only really interesting as a partner for her because of his wealth, because he can offer her and her whole family a solution for their financial troubles. He is interesting to her because of her own financial needs. So, on the one hand, the Marquis acquires his young wife because of his wealth and status, that he depends on to save her family from dire poverty, and at the same time, it's also pretty likely that he gets away with his crimes for so long because of his wealth and status, and his wife's lack thereof. A tale as old as time. If you're rich and powerful enough, you don't get into trouble for committing crimes, even if everybody knows you committed them, even if your wives keep disappearing mysteriously. In short, the story makes it super obvious through this class and money-based power imbalance how vulnerable a young girl from a financially weak background is to a powerful, incredibly wealthy man in a capitalist patriarchal system. She is an easy victim purely because of the way power is distributed in the world she lives in. For our last point that links back to the ruby collar, I'd like to chat about the fact that the story suggests that the heroine isn't the first of the Marquis's brides who wears the red necklace. She certainly isn't the first of the Marquis's brides to be marked with the sign of death, and she isn't the first who is supposed to die at his hands. She is intended to be the fourth. His violence is repetitive, something he does to all his wives. Through this repetition, violence becomes the rule, and this strengthens the argument that the story isn't about an exception, about a singular case, but about something regular. The intimate partner violence that all the Marquis's wives experience is not an isolated event, but an ongoing problem. It repeats over and over again, and it will not end unless it is stopped. It has to be brought to light and confronted to be ended, as the heroine and her mother, the famous killer of tigers, do. It's very important that it is these female characters who put an end to the violence that affects them together, as so many women who collaborated in the second wave feminist movement attempted to do as well, as feminism tries to do to this day. And that brings us to our last point about this story. It's not all just bloodshed and tyranny. There is also hope. I read an interesting article by one Kathleen Manley about the development of the heroine throughout the Bloody Chamber. In this article, Manley writes that the heroine oscillates between girlhood and womanhood, between a patriarchal view of herself and her own definition, her own self-image. She is a woman in process, suspended between a passive object position and an active subject position, from which she swings back and forth. The Marquis, of course, doesn't accept her as a subject and tries to force his script on her, the script where he can use her for sex and then kill her. So exert power over her in two different ways in this context. Now, much of the time, the heroine herself doesn't recognize her own agency either, but the text does. The text gives her the power of narration. She is the teller of the tale. That is a lot of power in the medium of a story. In addition, she occasionally gives herself the power of agency when she disregards the Marquis's orders. And very crucially, she tries to take steps to save herself, to organize help, and to eventually emerge unharmed and in a better position than before. For example, when she tries to seduce the Marquis to distract him from the bloody key. In this scene, she sees herself reflected in mirrors. She watches herself from the outside and sees a vulnerable, attractive young girl. But within, she thinks about taking control, about using the Marquis's lust against him and to strangle him once he comes close enough. This plan doesn't work, but the attempt to take action is there nonetheless. So here we see a fluttering between passivity and activity in the heroine. Manley says that the heroine doesn't recognize her own subjecthood fully. She is still young and unsure at the end of the story, but throughout the tale she develops towards becoming a confident subject. She survives because her mother rescues her and not because she overpowers the Marquis herself, so she hasn't reached that subjectivity. But the mother as a rescuer, instead of a male character as rescuer, serves as a role model for the girl. When the heroine enters the chamber, she says that she is brave because she is her mother's daughter, because she carries some of her mother's courage within her. And throughout the tale, she becomes more and more like the courageous and powerful woman her mother is. And having seen her mother use her agency to save her daughter, the daughter can perhaps find the same potential in herself. Yes, the heroine can't quite stand up for herself by herself yet, but she's moving in that direction with a supportive role model to guide her. And I think this is something that the heroine has in common with the development women as a general trend went through during the second wave of feminism. They were increasingly standing up for themselves and working to acquire more rights, more respect, more perspective, one step at a time. Of course, this process wasn't and still isn't completed. There's still loads that needs to be done. But as people existing in times of fundamental and important change, the women who were active in these movements, and even the ones who just witnessed them, were also women in process. And I think with this woman in process, within the story and out in the world, we have found the turning point, where the woman with the necklace develops from an objectified figure that reflects patriarchal structures without the possibility to work against them, where she turns from that into a subject that is still marked and held back by the collar of male ownership, but who realizes this and can take steps, or attempt to take steps, to free herself from this shackle disguised as ornament. The woman in process isn't alone in her struggle either. She has other women's achievements to build on, role models to look up to and to rely on for help. The tiger-slaying mother, the women of earlier generations whose shoulders she now stands on. Women who had fought for and won the right to vote, who had kept industries running during 2 world wars and had rebuilt their homes afterwards. These role models give her stability and courage, and even though the woman in the process of becoming a full subject still faces gender-based discrimination, she is becoming aware of this discrimination and she tries to speak up. She is a woman who knows that speaking up is difficult, not because she is mute by nature, but because her voice is deliberately being kept small, so that it is easier to ignore her. She tries to speak all the same though, quietly, uncomfortably, but she speaks. This voice that is kept small, that wavers and flutters, but attempts to speak all the same, is the voice of our final woman with a velvet ribbon, one that is very much our contemporary, the narrator of Carmen Maria Machado's The Husband Stitch, that has already become a modern classic, and that you can actually read for free on the publisher's website that I've linked in the sources. I'd highly recommend it. It's an excellent short story. Very disturbing though. And quite fittingly, it is a characterization of voices that The Husband Stitch begins with. This is how it starts. If you read this story out loud, please use the following voices. Me. As a child, high-pitched, forgettable. As a woman, the same. The boy who will grow into a man and be my spouse, robust, with his own good fortune. My father. Like your father, or the man you wish was your father. My son, as a small child, gentle, rounded, with the faintest of lisps. As a man, like my husband. All other women, interchangeable with my own. This initial stage direction alone gives us so much to discuss about the roles that women and men are assigned in our world, that the narrator's voice is identical as a child and as an adult, whereas the male voices change as they grow up, suggests that even though she does grow up, she becomes an adult, she isn't really perceived as a proper adult. And since all the other women's voices are the same, this applies to all of them. At the same time, we're pointed towards the idea that women are not really perceived as individuals between each other, but rather as a featureless blob that merges into one interchangeable, forgettable hump. Now, compare this with the husband's voice. Robust, with his own good fortune. This is someone confident. Someone who is perceived to be in control of their own life. Someone who can shape their own fate. And finally there's the son, who begins gentle and soft, only to grow into a replica, a mirror image of his father, with the same voice and the same certainty. The son learns from the father, perhaps without even realizing how to be a man. The role is learned as children grow into adults, passed on from one generation to the next, and this is something we'll come back to towards the end of this section as well. What's also interesting is that these stage directions are given by the narrator herself, so she is at the very least aware of these roles on an individual level. It could also mean that her own perception of herself and the other characters are tinted a certain way because of patriarchal gender roles. The rest of the story very much points towards this. But let's have a proper look at the story itself first. The Husband Stitch, a title that we'll definitely come back to. The Husband Stitch is related to us by a first-person narrator, the necklaced woman herself, who in good old-fashioned woman with necklace style is nameless, as is everyone else in the story. Everything begins with her seeing her future husband for the first time. At this point in time, the narrator is 17 years old and she spots her future husband at a garden party where she is instantly attracted to this pretty young man. It is her who approaches him, and on the same night they kiss for the first time. And on this night, after the kiss, he asks her what her ribbon is. She doesn't explain, but she tells him not to touch it. The The two teenagers soon become a couple, and the narrator loses her virginity to her boyfriend late one night in his car that is parked by the side of a lake. We don't know if he is a virgin or not. It doesn't seem to matter in his case. As the two of them sit in the car after having sex, the narrator tells her future husband that she saw something rise from the lake, some sort of creature, but he tells her it's nothing because he did not see the creature. This is one of many instances in the story where the narrator is told by either her husband or her father that she can't trust her own observations. She mentions a story from her childhood where she started screaming in the supermarket because she saw bloody toes between the produce, but her father told her that this was impossible, that she was being unfair to the shop's owner, and since no one but her saw anything, she must have been mistaken. The Husband Stitch is full of stories like this one. It is a collage of tales, urban legends, myths, and memories. The narrator tells us about the urban legend of the murderer with the hook hand escaped from an asylum, who is seen by a girl, but no one believes her before it is too late. She tells us about a woman who cuts the liver out of a corpse to serve it to her husband for dinner, and who realizes too late it was her own body and her own liver, not that of a stranger. And we hear the story of a girl who leaves her mother in a hotel room in Paris, only to be told when she returns that the room never existed and her mother is nowhere to be found. Almost like our friend Hoffman in the Dumas story in part 1, except of course he lost his sexy ribbon lady and not his mother. But these stories, as different as their plotlines and settings are, all circle around a theme that is crucial to Machado's short story. The theme of women being taught not to trust themselves, that others always know better. That they should question their perception of reality rather than to question what the men in their lives tell them. We could call it a kind of cultural gaslighting. I know this term gets thrown around as though it's meaningless, but I think here it does kind of seem to fit. The trajectory of losing confidence in her own judgment, of trusting herself less and less, is one that really describes our narrator's development over the course of the story, over the course of her relationship. The narrator and her boyfriend get engaged when they are only 18. On the day of their wedding, the husband first touches the narrator's ribbon. He does this while they have sex against a wall, just moments before the ceremony, as the narrator tells her husband to use her as he pleases. The second time he touches her ribbon is when she tells him that she is pregnant. On each of these occasions, he becomes more persistent, more aggressive in his intention of touching her ribbon, and it gets increasingly difficult for the narrator to get him to stop. At the same time, the touching of the necklace takes on a very sexual note, because the situations where the husband touches or tries to remove the necklace always happen during or directly after sexual interaction. So these two elements become inextricably linked to each other. Let's look at an example. This next quote is from the scene I just mentioned, where the narrator announces her pregnancy. The situation carries a strong implication of sexual violence and of physical threat, and the narrator's emotional response to this is described pretty explicitly. So if you'd rather skip this, you can jump forward about 2 minutes from here. He startles me then by running his hand around my throat. I put up my hands to stop him, but he uses his strength, grabbing my wrists with one hand as he touches the ribbon with the other. He presses the silky length with his thumb. He touches the bow delicately, as if he is massaging my sex. "Please," I say. "Please don't." He doesn't seem to hear. "Please," I say again, my voice louder but cracking in the middle. He could have done it then, untied the bow if he'd chosen to. But he releases me and rolls back on his back. My wrists ache and I rub them. "I need a glass of water," I say. I get up and go to the bathroom. I run the tap and then frantically check my ribbon, tears caught in my lashes. The bow is still tight. we see that she is very distraught in this moment, right? And she is scared of her husband in this situation. Her emotions are very clear in signaling that he crossed a boundary in a horrific way. But for him, there are no consequences. There is no criticism of his actions, nothing. The narrator is just about able to pluck up the strength to leave the situation and try to compose herself somewhat. Oftentimes, that is the case, that these kinds of violations don't really have consequences except for the violated person. So here I want to focus a little more on this sexual aspect because it really sits at the core of the story. The narrator and her husband almost only interact with each other in sexual contexts, and this comes from two directions. On the one hand, the narrator appears to be very much attracted to her husband, and she's very into having sex with him. Her desire is made explicit in the story, but at the same time, there is a passivity and a submissiveness in her sexuality that increases over the course of the marriage, and that doesn't seem like a sort of natural development. I'd say that in the context of this specific story that focuses on the narrator losing the agency and confidence in herself over time, her sexual submissiveness that gets more extreme at the same time is part of this development. It develops as a result of her husband's dominance and disrespect towards the wife. The husband complies a list of things he wants to do, and the narrator complies. The verbs she uses when she talks about sexual situations are very telling. She provides while her husband demands and takes. It's a very unequal relationship. And this dominance and disrespect culminate when he eventually kills her at the end of the tale by removing her ribbon. This is particularly interesting if we compare it to the sexual feelings the narrator has towards women. She takes part in a painting class and feels attracted to the nude model. And here the narrator voices feelings of admiration for the woman's beauty and an active desire to touch the model's body in an appreciative way. She seeks a conversation with her. It all feels mutual and balanced. But even this bit of sexual agency is taken away from the narrator the moment she tells her husband about it, because he objectifies her attraction to the nude model, tells her that it would be a fantasy of his to watch her and another woman. So the wife is not even allowed this little crush, an innocent crush where nothing ever happens. The husband takes control over it as well. She has nothing left for just herself. But it gets even worse. It is not just her behaviour, but also her body itself that the husband controls and adjusts according to his desires. After the narrator gives birth to her son and drifts in and out of consciousness because of the medication she's given, she overhears her husband ask the doctor about the so-called husband stitch. That's where the title comes in. The husband stitch is a procedure where if a birthing woman has experienced tearing to her perineum and it needs to be sewed back together, which is very common, and the husband stitch is basically when during this sewing back together an extra stitch is added that is supposed to make the vaginal canal tighter. Now this can be very painful for the woman, but apparently it's just grand for weird men obsessed with tight vaginas. The husband in the story brings up this procedure at the moment where his wife is in absolutely no state to consent or to disagree with him, and the men just make a decision about her body while she is drugged. Quote, "How much to get that extra stitch?" he asks. "You offer that, right?" "Please," I say to him, but it comes out slurred and twisted, and possibly no more than a small moan. Neither man turns his head towards me. The doctor chuckles. "You aren't the first." I slide down a long tunnel and then surface again, but covered in something heavy and dark, like oil. I feel like I'm going to vomit. The rumor is something like a Again, the narrator has a very strong reaction to her bodily autonomy being disrespected. She feels like she's going to vomit, understandably, but at the same time, there is nothing she can do. This scene is very representative of the overall issue that we see around women's bodies and reproductive rights being regulated and policed by basically random men. I also find it interesting that they specifically mention that the husband stitch is supposed to recreate the feeling of virginity. It is very much a notion of purity culture and sex as a marking of possession, right? That makes a virgin woman more valuable than one who's had sex. Excuse the awful simile, but it reminds me of people boasting that their car is new and not used. They're the first owner. It's just horrible. The husband stitch makes it all new and shiny again, it's all about possession. The husband exerting power over his wife's body, marking her as his own, and also he is the original owner, She is not allowed a shred of selfhood, neither regarding bodily autonomy nor regarding her sexuality, her experiences, her history. They all need to be controlled by the husband. And the doctor stands there and thinks it's funny. And it is this need for control, for complete, all encompassing control and power over her, that culminates in the husband becoming obsessed with the ribbon as the final piece of his wife that he wants to possess. Because, as we've seen before, it's the one thing where she's like, no, you don't get to mess with that. And then, of course, he wants to mess with it. There are several interactions throughout the story where the husband keeps pushing and pushing and pushing the narrator about the ribbon, and it becomes evident after a while that it is all about owning her. This interaction that I'm going to read you now takes place towards the end of the tale, when the couple's son is already in school, and this scene makes it unmistakably clear why the husband is so focused on the ribbon. So to contextualize, this happens as the narrator performs oral sex on her husband, not initiated by her, by the way, and he once again goes on to touch the ribbon. When he touches it, the wife pulls back, and this is what happens next. A wife, he says, should have no secrets from her husband. I don't have any secrets, I tell him. The ribbon. The ribbon is not a secret, it's just mine. Were you born with it? Why your throat? Why is it green? I do not answer. He is silent for a long minute. Then, a wife should have no secrets. My nose grows hot. I do not want to cry. I have given you everything you have ever asked for, I say. Am I not allowed this one thing? I want to know. You think you want to know, I say, but you do not. Why do you want to hide it from me? I'm not hiding it. It is not yours. Interactions like these become increasingly frequent and aggressive until at the very end of the tale, the husband finally wears the narrator down. She allows the husband to remove her ribbon. Specifically, she tells him to do what he wants, echoing their wedding day when she told him the same thing and he touched her ribbon for the first time. Just as the reader, the narrator herself knows that she will die if he unties the ribbon. This is an interesting point, because in this version, the husband does not remove the ribbon sneakily while the wife is asleep, the way we've seen it in most other versions of the tale. Instead, he wears her down until she agrees to it. By doing this, he creates a situation where he can pretend that she was actually okay with it and he did nothing wrong. After all, she said yes, after years of relentless force and coercion. And the narrator is so deeply entangled in this abusive relationship because that's what we are looking at here. She might believe this distorted version of events herself, or she would like to believe them. In fact, the narrator's final emotion, the final thought she expresses before she dies, just before she loses consciousness, is that she feels as lonely as she has ever been. She also mentions betrayal a few lines before. My interpretation of this is that when she told her husband to do what he wants, she was in a sense testing him. She doesn't tell him to untie the ribbon, she tells him to do what he wants. That is a crucial difference. A difference that I would argue expresses a last glimmer of hope that her husband will, after all, respect her, see her as a worthy, equal individual. and when he chooses the fulfillment of his own curiosity over respecting his wife's body and being, when he chooses that controlling every last part of her is what he wants, she realizes that she is alone in the world, that he was never her partner, her companion, or her friend. In connection with this, I want to highlight a statement the narrator makes just moments before she dies at the hands of her husband. She says, "He is not a bad man." And that, I realize suddenly, is the root of my hurt. He is not a bad man at all. And yet. Two things. One, the bar is in hell. In the underworld, under the floorboards of the lowest levels of Hades, if this man is not a bad man. He mistreats his wife, disrespects all her boundaries, physical and emotional. He makes decisions about her body while she is drugged and helpless. He controls every aspect of her life, and yet she is somehow convinced that he is not a bad man at all. The "and yet" suggests that she has her doubts, and they are confirmed at the very end when she expresses her deep loneliness, but before he takes the step to literally kill her, her doubts are not strong enough to stand up against the belief that he is a good man. And for all we know, the reason why she holds this belief is that the husband fulfills the patriarchal standards of a man who works, brings home the bacon, is relatively nice to his child, and only sexually assaults his wife in a subtle way, so it's fine. The bar is literally at the earth's core. Two, expanding on what I just said, this belief that a man is a good man as long as he's not literally beating the shit out of you is incredibly widespread and scarily familiar. I know so many women. I grew up surrounded by them, and I'm sure the same is true for many of you. Women who don't realize or can't admit to themselves that their partner mistreats them, because the mistreatment takes a shape that we have learned to accept as normal. Patriarchal structures have taught us that husbands talking down to their wives, men talking down to women in general, assuming that they must always know better, crossing their boundaries, showing them disrespect. We have been taught that these are normal behaviors, acceptable because they are so common. And of course it could always be worse. We have learned this, and the generations before us even more so. One example from my own background. In my own family, growing up, I was used to seeing men tell their wives that they are stupid and uneducated and that they don't know what they are doing. And after a long enough time, the women believed it. And it took me, as someone who wasn't directly spoken to like that, a long time to realize that this kind of behavior is abusive and not okay. And for the women who were being spoken to like this, it was even more difficult and sometimes impossible to unlearn this story that they've been told of their own inferiority. Now, I don't want to say that these behaviors are solely the result of patriarchal structures, but the patriarchal structures are definitely helping to make them look legitimate. What I mean to say by that is that it doesn't surprise me in a sense that the narrator says her husband is not a bad man, because it is very difficult to recognize harmful behaviors when they don't look the way we've been taught that they look. You know, if someone's not hitting you or something kind of more obvious like that, but they are emotionally violent or behave disrespectfully, these are things that we have learned to not see as that serious, especially when men do them to their partners. Basically, in a patriarchal world, it is difficult to recognize a bad man if he is not overtly, physically, extremely destructive. But let's get back to the story at hand and talk about how it establishes a causal link between the husband's increasingly controlling and boundary-crossing behavior and the narrator's character development. In the husband stitch, the further the story continues, the more the narrator loses her agency. She begins as a confident young girl who pursues a person she's attracted to, tells him what she wants and doesn't want, but over the course of their marriage she becomes unsure, while her husband grows more and more dominant. Slowly her self-esteem and her boundaries are chipped away. And with every small act of disrespect, with every violation, another piece of her person falls away until at the very end she can't even protect her own life any longer. She doesn't have the strength for it anymore. And she even believes that she's lucky to have found such a good man, as we said moments before he ends her life out of a selfish curiosity. The direct link between the narrator's ongoing loss of self-esteem and trust in herself and the husband's increasing disrespect towards her becomes even more evident once we realize that every time the husband touches her ribbon, this happens alongside an event that ties the narrator closer to the husband. On the day of their wedding, when she announces her pregnancy, and when their son moves out and the two are alone with each other again. There is a direct connection between the wife's growing emotional and material dependence on her husband and his increasing bravado in transgressing her boundaries that are embodied by the taboo of touching the ribbon. The ribbon that represents her vulnerability as a woman in the patriarchal world. This is a good moment to move on to the last point I want to discuss about this story, and that is what the husband stitch implies about gender roles, about how they come into being, and about how they are passed on and reinforced. Earlier, we spoke about the different second wave feminisms. I mentioned that there are, if we break it down to the most simple, two approaches to understanding gender and gender roles. So there's the approach of gender and sex being something that is inherent, something we are born with and that we can't really change, and there are certain qualities attached to it. The other one is that gender and gender roles are socially constructed and learned, and in theory could be changed if the conventions that carry them on change. Now, in the story, when the narrator's baby is born, she looks at the child to see if it is a boy or a girl. And here is what her narrative voice tells us when she cannot detect a ribbon. No ribbon. A boy. I begin to weep and curl the unmarked baby into my chest. The narrator cries tears of relief because she has a son. An unmarked baby. The term unmarked here is very important because it references Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex that I've mentioned earlier on in this episode. The text where de Beauvoir analyzes our binary gender roles as a learned structure where men are considered the unmarked proper subject while women are always the marked, the other, the object. They only exist in contrast to men. And since the son is an unmarked male boy child, he will be considered a subject, a full proper individual with his own good fortune, as the stage directions at the opening of the story tell us. And the mark that differentiates unmarked men from marked women in this story is the very visible and deadly ribbon that the women wear. The thing that differentiates women from men is the same thing that makes them vulnerable, the string their lives precariously hang onto. And the fact that this thing that both marks women as other and makes them vulnerable is then also sexualized by men who at the same time don't really know what it is. The husband, an adult man, has no idea where the ribbon comes from or what happens if he unties it. Basically, here we have a female body that is at once a highly sexualized object of desire and a taboo, an unspoken mystery. Now, what I also find interesting is that we know a little bit more about the ribbons in this story, and therefore also about the kind of born or learned idea of gender. We know that women are born with their ribbons, so the suggestion is that the mark of being a woman is something that is kind of thrust upon them by birth. It's kind of there, and there's not really anything they can do about it. And, since the ribbon is also the point where they are vulnerable, I would read this as women somehow being born with a kind of inherent vulnerability that just comes with being a woman. But I think the sexualized element and the need for protection that results from that is pure projection, in this case by the husband. Because for her, the ribbon is not something, sexual. It's not something that for her has a sexual meaning. I think that this represents that the female body is in some way generally different from the male body in an inherent way, but that its extreme cultural sexualization and objectification is not a given. It is a convention, it is taught and learned. And that it is taught and learned, we can observe very well in the way that the narrator's son changes the way he acts about his mother's ribbon. When he is little, he isn't bothered about the ribbon and sees it as just another part of the narrator's body, like a finger or something. He may touch it sometimes, but it's not a big deal. He doesn't pay it any mind. But as soon as he watches his father try to remove the ribbon and insist on knowing why it is there, once he hears him say that a wife must not have any secrets from her husband, the boy begins to pull at the ribbon despite his mother telling him not to. He copies his father's behavior towards his mother and towards women in general. The son learns that the ribbon is something to go after, something to desire and to pursue. He learns that it doesn't matter if a woman says no. He sees his father disrespect his mother's boundaries with no consequences, so he does the same. Patriarchal structures are learned and passed on. Once more, mirroring Simone de Beauvoir, Machado's story tells us that patriarchal gender roles and power structures are not inherent, and especially their destructiveness is something that is learned and passed on from generation to generation. Therefore, they could be changed. But for this narrator, it is too late. She loses her life as a result of these gender roles. For our final bit of analysis, we will consider all the stories we've looked at today and compare them with the older tales from part 1. For this, I really want to go back to the question of where the horror comes from in these tales. I think looking for the origin of horror is a very productive way to figure out what these stories convey, because fear is such an intense and primal emotion. It signals what is really important. So we can learn a lot when we try to find out what causes it. Now, if you remember, in part 1 we said that the horror of the guillotined woman comes from her being associated with castration anxiety and a loss of agency, with big ambitious dreams turned to absolute nightmares. And that fit well into the period following the French Revolution, whose good intentions descended into random bloodshed and state-sanctioned terror. The narrative focus and the introspection were with the male student main characters, and the women remained relatively empty placeholders that were defined pretty much only by their fragmented, unstable bodies that balance between life and death. To get to this, we use psychoanalytic theory that focuses a lot on the breaching of key boundaries as the source of fear and horror. Boundaries like the one separating the inside and the outside of the body, and the one between life and death. Those two are the most important for these kinds of stories. To feel safe and secure in our understanding of the world, we rely on these kinds of basic boundaries. We need them to structure the world, to make sense of it, and to give us helpful, reassuring categories. Now, in the children's stories that we started this episode with, the women are still, as in the old tales, mostly defined by the fact that their head falls off. But there's an important difference regarding the head falling off business. These women aren't dead like the guillotined women, who lie lifeless already before their necklaces, and as a result their heads are removed. The women here are asleep, possibly in some kind of in-between state, but they are definitely not already completely dead. As far as we know, they're alive, or at least seemingly alive, and would stay that way if their ribbons stayed on. So removing the ribbon isn't a simple act of examining a body that's already dead and discovering some evidence for ghostly activity. It is an active, destructive violation of a very physical body. Both of these types of stories have the shock moment of surprise decapitation that we know from a psychoanalytic perspective. It's mostly scary because it reminds us of how quickly a person can lose their agency, how quickly they can get fragmented, how quickly the boundaries of their body are broken. and that is scary to somebody who witnesses that. But in the 70s children's stories, there's the added horror of sudden death. So it's not mostly the boundaries of the body that are disrupted, but the boundary between life and death. The women go from living humans to stone-dead corpses within a second, completely unexpected to the husband, and I think that makes this life-death boundary feel even more fragile. So instead of the main horror being that of losing agency, I think the main horror in these children's stories is the horror of how quickly the life-death boundary can be transgressed. The literal horror of losing our lives, which of course ties into losing agency, but this is more intense and more extreme. This is final. And if we then move on to the bloody chamber and the husband stitch, horror still originates in a fear of the disintegration of the body and in a fear of death, but from a different direction, we could say. The source of these two fears is no longer the bodies of the women. It's not them who destabilize order by unexpectedly disintegrating and dying all over the place while the point of view characters look on in terror. Here it is the order that destabilizes and destroys. And it is the disintegrating women themselves who experience the horror of their own death. So during the second wave of feminism that reanalyzed gender roles, the source of horror in these stories shifted from the women's bodies that destabilize order by being tempting and deceptive and supernatural to the violent actions of men who harm women. And this is directly linked to the shift in perspective. Because when the women who before were mysterious and unknowable become the narrators and become familiar to the reader, and we realize they're simply trying to exist and not suffer, why should we find them horrific or scary? There's no reason. When they become fully rounded people instead of fragmented bodies, we empathize with them. They grow from objects that are used as a site of shock and terror to the subjects who experience the horror themselves and share it with the reader. The horror they experience takes the shape of disrespect, exploitation, and physical violence. The women are not the source of horror. They live through it. Their deaths are no longer jump scares, but tragedies. In The Bloody Chamber, this very much takes the form of gothic horror. An innocent young heroine discovers the bloody secret of a dark place of decay where her life is in danger because of a powerful villainous male figure. Carter uses the critical potential of the classic Gothic genre, employs its archetypal characters and settings as a tool to draw attention to power imbalance and systemic violence in male-female relationships and the dynamics between these two genders on a societal scale. She goes to the extreme, to the shocking and melodramatic mode of the Gothic genre to make her point about a very commonplace issue very obvious. Machado's approach, in contrast, is a subtle one. She does something similar, but she does it differently. The horror in The Husband Stitch is not that of a spooky castle and an unknown horror movie-esque villain. Machado situates her feminist critique exactly where the inequality she criticizes usually takes place, in the private, everyday space of the nuclear family, in the general population, in the life of an ordinary woman. The horror in this story is a domestic one, a looming dread that often remains quite obscure, an unsettling hum underneath the story. A story in which there is no justice, no resolution, only rupture. And I think it is because this horror is so private and subtle and everyday that there is no resolution, like in Angela Carter's story. The narrator in The Husband Stitch doesn't have the look to be a fairy tale heroine. She's an ordinary woman who no one pays particular attention to, who slips away under the radar like millions of others. She is not the victim of a bloodthirsty serial killer whose actions are obvious crimes. She is the victim of gaslighting, of toxicity, of emotional abuse, of intimate partner violence. The crimes against her are too commonplace to be noticed. She is a woman we all know. The woman who excuses her husband's enraged outbursts because he only ever raises his voice but not his hand. She is the woman who tells herself he doesn't really mean it, he's just overworked, and if she only tries hard enough and does everything right, they will be one happy family again. She is the woman who stays because she believes her children need a father. She's a woman each of us could all too easily become, even if we firmly believe it could never happen to us. In this episode, we've spoken a lot about how the women with choker stories from the 1970s strongly reflect the issues that second-wave feminism tackled. It was a time when the frustration of gender-based oppression and the lack of proper bodily autonomy came to a point. And I don't think I'll be telling any of you anything new when I say that we find ourselves at a point like this again. And it isn't surprising that the motif of the woman with the choker resurfaces and resonates right now. In a period where alt-right alpha male culture that calls all women whores and justifies rape is blooming online, in a period where the US elect a fascist sex offender as president after completely fucking up their abortion rights, a period where European governments are shifting massively to the right, where the second strongest party in the German parliament are literal Nazis, a period where the queer community, especially the trans community, who are fighting so hard to be treated with some basic respect, are villainized and discriminated against, as anti-trans hate crime is on the rise and inclusive legislation gets overturned in many countries all over the world. Of course, a story like this one that deals with patriarchal violence and oppression resurfaces now. I don't think it's a coincidence that Her Body and Other Parties, that the husband Stitch is part of, was published in 2017 during the first Trump presidency, right after the height of the Me Too movement. The story was originally written before that, but the moment of its publishing is not a coincidence, I'm sure. And I don't think it's a coincidence either that so many female and queer artists who have risen to prominence in the past few years are so vocal about things like sexuality, bodily autonomy, and the issues of intimate partner violence, misogyny, and queerphobia. The artist whose work the title of this episode is taken from, I Am Held Captive by the Ribbon Around My Neck, is the all-female band The Last Dinner Party, who released their debut album in 2024. Much of their music deals with the threat of violence against women from strangers and from partners, the objectification and exploitation of women's bodies, responsibility women often take for their partner's actions, and they identify this as something women learn to do in our society from the women who came before us, and trying to survive in a patriarchal world taught us to do the same thing. As the lyrics of their song The Feminine Urge so aptly put it, I am a dark red liver stretched out on a rock. All the poison I converted and I turn it to love. This is the feminine urge, I know it so well, to nurture the wounds my mother held. I really hope the increased attention that these systemic inequalities are given in creative fields contributes to creating a shift. And I don't mean only when it comes to gender, but also regarding race, class, sexual orientation, disability. But what is really crucial, what we desperately need, is political action, visible activism, boycotts, strikes, grassroots movements, community support, good quality education about topics that matter, that we need to work on. We collectively need to become better than greed and complacency and, oh, but it's none of my business and you don't actually care, you're just virtue signaling. Because one, it's everybody's business because we are all in this world. And two, so many of us actually do care, not just about the issues that affect us personally, but also about the inequalities that hold others down. And to be honest, a worldview that tells you that everyone who cares about other people's issues is just virtue signaling to make themselves look good is so fucking sad, and I refuse to believe that that's true for most people. I mean, I'm not affected by racism or transphobia, but I now understand from what people report who are affected by these things that they are fucking horrible. And I don't think anyone should have to be suffering from horrible forms of discrimination. So if there's anything I can do about that, I will try my best. And I am not the only one. So many people agree with that. So many people see it the same way. And, I know that sometimes it feels like we're just tiny cogs in a massive system. A massive machine that we can't stop droning on and on. I feel like that a lot of the time, and it's discouraging. But, if enough of these cogs refuse to cooperate, the machine might stop. We should try our best to stop it. Okay. Sorry for ranting and for bringing everybody down, but unfortunately this is the reality we live in, and it's very important that we face it, because otherwise it'll just continue getting worse. And no, I will not keep politics out of my podcast, because pop culture and art and storytelling and what we make of them are always political. Always have been, always will be, and there is potential and power in that. Oh, and just in case, if you believe that trans people don't deserve rights, or that people of colour don't deserve rights, or women, or gay, bisexual, asexual people, I would like you to think about why you believe that. My guess is that you're afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of the unknown, afraid of losing your job, your status, your financial and physical safety. The familiar world you grew up in and that you love is gradually disappearing, turning to concrete, dirt, and soullessness. And now consider who it is who is taking these things away from you. Is it women who don't want to be sexually assaulted? The trans community that wants to be allowed to exist without being hate crimed? Or is it the so-called free market that keeps increasing prices and cutting wages, slowly replacing employees with technology that doesn't need breaks or pay, all to line their own pockets? Is it your government that keeps reducing spending on education and social services and healthcare in order to pump money into the sectors they can most benefit from? Who is the problem? Think about that. To help you, because hindsight is always easier, I'll ask you to remember the French Revolution we spoke about in the first part of this double feature. Who caused the poverty, the financial crisis, the unbearable living conditions that the majority of the population suffered under, that were what the revolution responded to? Was it the people who didn't have bread and for some reason didn't just eat cake? I know that's a misquote, but the sentiment is very real. Were they just too stupid to eat cake? Were they too silly to get themselves some chickens when eggs got too expensive? Or was it the aristocracy who kept taking and taking and taking so they could sleep in gold-plated beds and silken sheets without ever paying tax? Is it the trans people or the immigrants or the women who are causing you to earn the same wage for the past 10 years even though the cost of living has skyrocketed and you can barely get by? Or is it the people who actually hold the power high up in industries and politics who get to decide how much you earn, who get to decide who pays how much tax, how that tax money is used, and who decide to use it for their own benefit rather than for healthcare, social services, and education? Who is it? Who even has the ability to control these decisions? The answer should be obvious. But anyway, ribbons. Girls like me, silly girls, we just love cute ribbons, okay? That's all I'm doing here, talking about cute ribbons. I'm definitely not encouraging anyone to question authority and voice your criticisms. I would never do that. I don't even know what that means. Those words are way too complicated for me. So please, as we reach the end of this colossus of an episode, yet another word that's too difficult for me, colossus, what the hell is that? I'm definitely only asking for your best ribbon tying techniques. Do you do a little bow? Do you have a shiny clasp, maybe with diamonds on it? Do you prefer black or green velvet? Or are you a ruby girly? Let me know definitely don't give this podcast a rating on Spotify. People might see it and listen to it. Don't write any comments either, or do the poll under the episode, because that would mean that you're having a thought or an opinion, and we don't want that. And under no circumstances whatsoever recommend Midnight Culture Club to your friends who like lame nerdy shit like books and films and like care about the state of the world. Definitely don't tell them, they won't like it. In fact, don't tell anyone about Midnight Culture Club. That's the first rule. Midnight Culture Club has to stay secret, and we're definitely not making all that soap to produce insane amounts of explosives on the side that we need to blow up office blocks to rebel against late-stage capitalism. We would never do that. We just like cute chokers and want to marry rich men. Sorry if the soap comment didn't make sense. It's a Fight Club joke. Of course, I don't know Fight Club, except that Brad Pitt is shirtless in it. That's all I know. Because I'm just a silly little girl, and you might be too. I don't know. I don't know what fighting is, apart from fighting the dry ends on my hair. Oh, my brain is fried. Thank you for being here and lending me your lovely ears. I hope this double feature was interesting. Sorry it took so long to make part 2. I know it's been several months. I don't know what happened there. It was a lot of research and writing and disentangling my thoughts, but yeah, I hope it was worth the wait. That you enjoyed this foray into necklace lady stories, learned something, had a good time, or a depressing time occasionally, more than occasionally. Sorry about that as well. Next time we'll be a bit more cheerful. Maybe. I can't make any promises. We'll probably be depressing again, the way I know myself. But most of all, I hope to see you again soon. Sooner this time, here on the nocturnal side. Sweet dreams and good night.